Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, TLS 1.3, Expert Advice to Modernize Your Security and Decryption Practices. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are Paula Musich, Research Director at Enterprise Management Associates, and Scott Register, VP of Product Management at Ixia, a Keysight business. Paula brings over 30 years of experience covering the IT security and networking technology markets. As a security technology analyst, Paula has tracked and analyzed competitive developments in the threat management segment of the information security market. Scott has more than 15 years of experience leading product management operations for global technology companies. He holds ABS and MS degrees in computer science from Georgia Institute of Technology and also served as a member of the research faculty. And before I hand things over to today's featured speakers, I wanted the audience to know that Paula and Scott will be concluding today's presentation by taking your questions. Do feel free to log them anytime using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA that will include the on-demand playback, a PDF of the speaker slides, and Ixia also has a free white paper for you on today's topic, so I hope you will check that out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our first featured speaker, Paula Musich. Paula?
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. So let's get started. So after 10 years in the making, the new TLS 1.3 IETF standard for transport encryption was finally published in the second half of 2018. It added several performance improvements for Internet users, including a reduction in the number of round trips needed in the initial session handshake. Rather than 2 round trips, TLS 1.3 only requires 1 thanks to the use of TLS false start and TCP fast open. It also takes less time to negotiate protocol versions. More importantly, though, it added a whole series of security and privacy improvements by doing a few things, including eliminating obsolete ciphers and hashes, adding downgrade protection, encrypting the certificate itself, and also by requiring the use of the Diffie-Hellman ephemeral perfect forward secrecy key exchange rather than the existing static private key exchange. This essentially means that every conversation generates a unique key so that the compromise of a private or static key in the future won't compromise the confidentiality of all past sessions. Even if an attacker recorded and stored previous encrypted conversations, they'd still need the keys for each individual conversation in order to decode them and listen in. Although this was an option in TLS 1.2, it's now mandated in 1.3. The trade-offs with these enhancements for enterprises is that it breaks their existing security monitoring and performance troubleshooting controls because the static key that those controls relied on to decrypt traffic to examine it for malware or performance issues isn't there anymore. It's also important to note, though, that the new TLS 1.3 specification was made backward compatible by allowing the traffic to revert to earlier versions that don't use perfect forward secrecy. Given these different issues, EMA sought to gauge enterprise IT's awareness of the nuances in the new standard, understand their plans for adopting TLS 1.3 and how they intend to adjust their security and networking infrastructure to accommodate the changes. The survey also delved into overall encryption practices within the enterprise, and we did find some interesting usage trends. The methodology of the study, we surveyed 250 North American IT practitioners, primarily those in security roles, and that data was gathered towards the end of last year. Given the potential impact on security architectures, we sought to emphasize in our base of response those with responsibility for IT security, and as you can see on the slides here, 67% of respondents had direct responsibility for security, while another 40% had roles at the IT director, manager, or supervisor level, and then another 27% had IT executive roles. So let's take a look at some of the findings on encryption trends. Overall encryption use in the enterprise is growing, and that trend is expected to continue. But that does also parallel the growing use of encryption by bad actors to hide their attacks which has been greatly aided by the advent in 2016 of the free Let's Encrypt TLS certificate authority. So given those two trends, we asked respondents how worried they were that their existing security monitoring capabilities might miss malware hidden in encrypted files traversing their networks. It's interesting that 35% were either very or extremely concerned, while 36% were only somewhat concerned. We also asked respondents how worried they were that their existing security monitoring capabilities might miss malicious behavior that's hidden in legitimate traffic, and the same percentages were reported on that front. I think this really reflects a gap in awareness. So given the concerns about missing malware hidden in encrypted traffic, we asked respondents what percentage of their network traffic they decrypt for analysis. We gave them 4 different ranges to select and the option to say they didn't know. The answers varied quite a bit depending on the size of the organization. The top range for SMBs, mid-sized organizations, and large enterprises was 26 to 50%, but within that range, the percentages of each reporting that varied quite a bit. The top response for very large enterprise respondents, for example, was split between 26 to 50% and I don't know. And given the great complexity of large-scale networks and the decentralized nature of very large IT organizations, this lack of awareness is not necessarily surprising. We also wanted to gauge how organizations go about decrypting traffic for troubleshooting and monitoring for malware. There are several options available in the market, but they generally fall into 2 buckets. There's inline or man-in-the-middle decryption and re-encryption, or there's passive or out-of-band decryption. Of the 5 different commonly available options for decryption, the top choice among our respondents was to decrypt using a web proxy, followed by decrypting using an inline security device, and then an out-of-band security device. If you aggregate all of the inline options together, those made up the majority of the choices. There are risks and advantages that come with each type of model, but I'm not sure that those are well understood in the market. That's likely to change, however, as organizations come to grips with what it will take to maintain visibility into network traffic as TLS 1.3 enablement takes hold in the market. We also asked respondents where within their networks they were enabling encryption and for which types of services. The top choices were within the enterprise network and within the data center when it comes to location, and that really makes sense since IT controls both ends of the transaction, both the client and the server. Also, the data center holds the organization's crown jewels, so it's critical to ensure that the security and privacy of the data flowing across those internal links is kept in place. I also think that most IT security practitioners now have really come to recognize that their networks are already compromised or already, quote, dirty, as one practitioner said to me. So encryption is really another way to better protect mission-critical data that's in motion. I think it's rather concerning that so few respondents reported using encryption for homegrown applications. That makes those applications a prime target for attackers, and the damage they can potentially inflict could be fairly high. So looking ahead at where organizations intend to implement encryption over the next 2 years, we found that most organizations plan to enable it sooner rather than later, both within the enterprise network and the data center, as well as for email, web services, and for internally developed applications. The fact that they're looking at that within the next 6 months, or at least within 6 months of late last year, really confirms the overall trend towards the greater use of encryption and shows how quickly that's really happening. So now I'd like to dive into some of the findings specific to TLS 1.3, specifically some of the drivers behind that quick adoption and concerns that it raises. So given the visibility issues raised by the changes in TLS 1.3, it's no surprise that respondents said they were concerned about both the security and the operational implications of the newly minted standard. As you can see, at least 40% said that they had some concerns over the security implications, and another 21% expressed significant concerns. At the same time, 34% expressed some concerns, and another 22% expressed significant concerns over the operational implications of the standard. What was really surprising, though, is how quickly respondents' organizations are moving ahead with TLS 1.3 enablement. Usually when standards change in a way that requires a change in existing architectures, enterprises are relatively slow and cautious in their adoption of those standards. IPv6 is a prime example of that. In this case, though, we found that 41% of respondents' organizations plan to enable TLS 1.3 within 6 months for inbound connections, and another 40% said enablement was already underway for internal traffic, and that was late last year, like late November. Less than 5% said they weren't planning to enable it at all, and only 6% said they would push enablement out 13 to 18 months into the future. So what's behind this fast adoption cycle? The top motivations driving it, according to our respondents, are better end-to-end privacy and data security. As you can see, 73% of respondents said better data security is really key in enabling TLS 1.3. And 67% said that better end-to-end privacy is also very important. It could be that the perception among security practitioners that their networks are dirty has become widespread enough that they are looking at encryption as a means to better protect sensitive data. It's interesting to note that despite the performance gains or reduced latency enabled with the zero round-trip time enhancement in TLS 1.3, only 44% of respondents indicated that that was very important. I think that reflects the priorities of IT security practitioners who put data security first and foremost and really well before performance issues. Ultimately, though, I think improved data security and better performance are a win-win for both security practitioners and end users. The losing side of the equation, though, is in the operations cost required to adapt to TLS 1.3. Major web server vendors such as Microsoft, Google, and others were early adopters of TLS 1.3 even before the standard was completed. I believe they're trying to drive broader market adoption of it, and they're also trying to demonstrate their commitment to their customers' privacy. As organizations work to adapt their internal web application development to keep pace with those web services vendors, they worry that enabling TLS 1.3 in their web applications will increase development time and cost, increase operations lifecycle time and costs, and increase development training time and costs. And when it comes to security operations, there's also going to be increased costs associated with adjusting the organization's security architecture to work with a new TLS 1.3 standard. How much of an increase that respondents estimate really varies by the size of the organization. The majority of respondents in the SMB and mid-sized enterprises, those respondents expect the cost to adapt to TLS 1.3 will fall between $100,000 to $250,000. For large enterprises, the largest percentage of respondents there expect that adjustment cost will be between $250,000 to $1,000 to $500,000. And not surprisingly, respondents representing very large enterprises expect that cost to top $1 million. Of course, that's a drop in the bucket for enterprises with IT security budgets exceeding $100 million annually. Actually, I recently saw an article that said J.P. Morgan Chase spends about $600 million a year on IT security. So $1 million to them is really not a big pain point. So now the question is, how do these organizations intend to address the visibility issues caused by TLS 1.3? The largest percentage of respondents said their organizations would maintain existing firewalls at earlier versions of TLS for as long as possible. This obviously represents a serious disconnect between that option and moving ahead with plans to enable it. The other most predominant answer straddles both inline and out-of-band models, with responses from SMBs pushing up the percentage of respondents who selected replacing existing stateful inspection firewalls with proxy-based firewalls for out-of-band inspection. One of the other two most popular choices is to enable decryption and re-encryption on existing inline security devices and hoping that it doesn't add too much latency, complexity, or security vulnerability. I think what it says is that there's a lack of understanding of the implications of enabling TLS 1.3, and there is going to have to be a reckoning at some point along the way. We also asked respondents to tell us how their organizations will approach enabling TLS 1.3. Their answers varied by the size of the organizations that they represented. And they're looking at the nature of the traffic, not just whether it's internal or external. It doesn't really surprise me that the majority of large enterprises plan to enable it first for critical traffic, then other traffic if possible. And it makes sense that the largest percentage of mid-sized organizations said that they would enable TLS 1.3 for critical traffic only. It's no surprise since they're more resource constrained. The only answer that really doesn't make a lot of sense to me is the 46% of SMBs who said that they'd enable it for all traffic at once. That really could be a recipe for failure, although I suppose from a policy perspective it could be simpler. So just to summarize some of the key findings of the study, we found that the use of encryption is growing fairly quickly across all sizes of organizations. But respondents did acknowledge that the growing practice does raise some concerns over the ability to inspect it for malware and inspect for indications of malicious activity hidden in encrypted files as well as among legitimate traffic. At the same time, we were surprised by the rapid uptake of the new standard given its implications for existing security architectures. And we found an apparent disconnect between how respondents' organizations intend to adapt to the changes required in order to maintain visibility that they need for monitoring for malware as well as troubleshooting performance problems. We really think there's an education effort required to bridge that gap. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to turn it over to Scott Register from Ixia's Keysight business.
Scott, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Is this better?
Yes, we can hear you now. So take it away.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I was just saying thank you, Paula and Raleigh, for teeing that up, and for those of you attending. And I'd like now to drill down into some of the topics that that Paula raised in the introduction there, and going over the survey. So we'll often think about encryption as a double-edged sword, right? Because you gain a lot of things and you give up some things. Obviously, we couldn't do business on the internet without encryption, right? You wouldn't be willing to send a credit card number or sensitive emails or any of those things if we couldn't encrypt that data in transit. But because those connections are encrypted, some critical things that you need to do for your business, such as checking for malware downloads or monitoring quality of service or troubleshooting problems, can be made much more difficult. And that's that's a basic trade-off that you typically have to weigh with security in general. Is make some things harder, but that makes your life better. But TLS 1.3 really does throw some new kind of wrinkles into the mix because of some of the changes that you'll need to make in your architecture. And today, obviously, specifically, we're talking about TLS 1.3 and some of the changes there. And I'll drill down into some of those. It's probably a good thing just to spend a moment here thinking about the difference between privacy and security. And Paula alluded to this earlier. Most of the improvements in security per se in the TLS 1.3 standard come from the deprecation of some older ciphers, some ciphers that were being used that are now not considered terribly secure, just because as brute force, encryption hacking and things like that get easier and cheaper, we have to keep advancing things forward to make sure that just mathematically, encryption is hard to break. Now the privacy part, and this is certainly a big change in TLS 1.3, privacy is better because it's harder for anyone to read your sessions, but that means even, let's say, authorized users, right? Even if an enterprise wants to inspect data inside its network, maybe looking for attacks on its web servers, it's harder to inspect. That traffic. Again, and another benefit here of 1.3, as Paula mentioned, is connection setup will be faster. So user experience in general with TLS 1.3 should be better. And I'll talk about that a little as we move forward. So quick note, you'll hear both the terms SSL and TLS used. SSL, or Secure Sockets Layer, was really the popular acronym up through 99. And then when a new draft of the standard came out, the TLS 1.0 spec, it's basically a little broader. And so officially we refer to this web encryption as TLS, Transport Layer Security. But those are often used interchangeably, or specifically SSL will be used as kind of the umbrella term to mean any web encryption. Certainly I do that all the time. And so just for purposes of this discussion, they're really, they're really interchangeable. And obviously you know that you're using an encrypted session, like if you're coming from your web browser, because you see the little lock icon in the bar on your browser, and that means, hey, the session to Wikipedia here is encrypted. It's important to remember, though, that the little lock icon means the session is encrypted, and it means you are talking to someone you trust. It doesn't actually mean that you are talking directly to Wikipedia. And as we get into, later as we get into how man-in-the-middle and SSL proxies work, that might become a little more clear. But a lot of people have that misconception that, oh, if I see that little lock and a website, that means that's who I'm talking to and it's secure. It actually just means the connection is encrypted and you're talking to someone you trust, but you're not necessarily talking to that end site that's listed in the bar. Also notice here, we've been through multiple revisions of the SSL or TLS standard. Some of them came out pretty quickly, especially in the early days. You'd have maybe a year between releases. But this last rev, like moving to TLS 1.3, that took a decade and lots of revisions of the draft, like at least 13 revisions. And part of that was because of the significant changes that were introduced and the requirements for people to change their monitoring infrastructures. And a lot of big companies, especially financial institutions, really pushed back on some of the requirements in the TLS 1.3 spec, just because the expense for them to kind of rip and replace their entire architecture is significant. I mean, in many cases, people like financial institutions have a compliance requirement to, let's say, save every transaction on and off of their web servers for 72 hours or 7 days or whatever. And that was a lot easier if you're using TLS 1.2 or before. TLS 1.3, decrypting those sessions and storing them becomes a lot more difficult and in many cases more expensive. And that's why it took so long to get this spec out. It was certainly the most controversial, I think you would say, release to date. Okay, so let's talk about some of those differences. So when we're not going to try to do a complete deep dive into public key cryptography here. We've posted other webinars that go over that. But just kind of a quick introduction. There are public keys and private keys, and each server has a private key that it keeps to itself and a public key that it publishes to the world. And those keys are really just used to secure kind of a connection setup. And then once data starts flowing, between a client and server, let's say between your web server and Facebook or wherever, that data is encrypted with what's called a session key. Now, with TLS 1.2 and before, anytime a given client and server spoke to each other, they used the same session key. And if you had a copy of the private key that was used by the server, you could watch that session get set up and decrypt it. And you could do that passively. You could do it kind of snooping on the connection. Or you could stream an entire encrypted session to disk, and then on demand, if you needed to go back and debug something or look for a security problem, you could do that. because you own that server key, and you could read the handshake where the session key was established, and then you could read stuff. With ephemeral keys, ephemeral means temporary, right? And so mandatory in TLS 1.3 and optional in TLS 1.2, anytime that client server talk, there's a brand new key created. And this gives you a feature called forward secrecy, or sometimes perfect forward secrecy. What that means is even if someone hacks, let's say breaks, reads somehow the session key that's used in a particular session between a client and server, they can't then reuse that session key to inspect later sessions. So breaking one session doesn't give you access to subsequent ones, hence the phrase forward secrecy. Now, one of the reasons this was introduced, you can imagine if someone, let's say, compromised the server key that was used at a particular bank, in theory, they could sit on maybe a public Wi-Fi network, and armed with that private key, they could then derive the session keys that were used for any people on that Wi-Fi network, go into that bank, and then decrypt their traffic. And that obviously would be a bad thing, right? And that's really what prompted this move in TLS 1.3 to requiring the ephemeral keys, right? The downside being, and we'll talk about the implementation details, if you want to read an encrypted session that's encrypted with ephemeral keys, you have to be an active part of the session. You can't just sit off to the side and kind of watch it happen. You have to be part of it. So obviously the privacy there is much better. But if you're trying to do legitimate monitoring, let's say I own a website and I want to check all the connections to my web server to see if there's an attack embedded in it, no longer can I sit off to the side and watch that. I actually have to participate in the session, and that requires a lot of changes, right, in people's networks. So this is sort of what that would look like. The picture on the left is if you're using static keys, so 1.1 or before, and most people, and even if you had upgraded your server to 1.2, we're still using static keys. So you could literally kind of hang off to the side of the network. You could use a tap. You could hook up to the span port on a switch. You could either decrypt traffic while it's happening, or as I noted, you could just dump all that data off to disk, and then if you discovered, oh, there was either an attack or a user had a problem, you could go back and read their particular connection, even though it was encrypted, off disk, and then decrypt it on the fly. Because if this is your site and you own the server's encryption keys, it's not that hard to do. And so it's very straightforward to do security monitoring and troubleshooting and things like that. And also note that this imposes zero impact on the original encrypted sessions. You're not slowing them down. You're not introducing a point of failure. All those sessions go on whether you're monitoring them or not, and you basically have no impact on them. The picture on the right shows what the world looks like if you're trying to monitor either internal connections or people on the internet coming in and connecting to your web server if you're using ephemeral keys. So that little box there with a lock on it, that's what we call an SSL proxy, or you'll sometimes hear it referred to as a man in the middle. And so if you're doing monitoring in this situation, what actually happens is the client establishes a connection to that proxy. Now it's all transparent to the user. They just, the user types in the address of the web server and they think they're going there directly. That device in the middle will actually intercept the session and then establish two encrypted sessions, one between the web browser or the client and itself, and then a new encrypted session between itself and the destination web server. And then that device in the middle, the proxy or the man in the middle, has access to all of the clear text traffic. So it can do things like send a copy of that clear text traffic off to the recording device there at the bottom. And remember earlier when I said that you see the address in the browser bar and it shows a little lock and it shows a website, that means it's encrypted and you trust the person you're talking to, but it doesn't mean you're actually talking directly to that listed website. So this is an illustration of that. The client, the web browser, is really, that encrypted session ends at the SSL proxy. He doesn't really know that there's that proxy in the middle, but in this case, that client operating system or web browser has to trust the SSL proxy, and that's done basically by distributing certificates. So as long as that happens, to the user it's all transparent. You get the lock icon on your browser, even though there's this other device in the middle that's basically terminating the session, reading all your data, and then establishing a connection outbound. And that's why you'll hear that term "man in the middle." It's because there is this device that's sitting in the middle of the connection and inspecting it. Now, it's important to remember here, I'm really talking about internal connections, like a web server, inside a company that internal users are connecting to, or about people coming in, let's say, from the internet and connecting to your maybe e-commerce server. If you're thinking about inspecting traffic for users going out to the internet and maybe downloading malware, or they're just connecting to some external site and you want to see what they're doing to make sure they're not leaking information, really you always have to use the implementation on the right. That always requires a man in the middle or an SSL proxy. It's really the internal or the inbound connections where there's going to be a change required when moving to ephemeral key, which is, again, mandated in 1.3. Now, in many cases, you don't have a single security device between, let's say, users out on the internet and your internal servers, or even for outbound traffic, for users going out to the internet, you might have one thing that does antivirus, you might have a firewall, you might have a data loss protection device or data leak protection, DLP, and each of these devices needs access in order to do its inspection to clear text data, right? If the connection was encrypted, in order for these security devices to do their inspection, the data has to be encrypted. So one way that you can do that is you can have each device do its own decryption and then re-encryption. Obviously, this is going to impose a performance penalty because it's a lot of extra overhead for every single connection. And also, it's going to weaken your ability to implement policy because the device, let's say on the inside, closest to the web browser, doesn't have access to information about the external site. And so if you wanted to write a rule that says, don't allow my internal users to connect to external web servers that use really weak encryption, well, that's a lot harder to do just because it's harder to see both ends of the connection. And so it's generally better, rather than forcing every device to do its own decryption and re-encryption, to basically have a single SSL inspection proxy or device which can decrypt traffic once, and then all of your different security tools can do their own inspection and just deal with the clear text traffic. So then you're not imposing that processing overhead, that additional latency of decrypting and re-encrypting every session multiple times. Now, this could be done a couple of different ways. You could do it with a dedicated appliance. The way that we recommend is doing it in a network packet broker, and I'll explain why that has some benefits. And in some cases, certainly people do this with they'll have a single security device, like a firewall that does the SSL inspection, and and then basically the connection gets there, it decrypts it, does its security thing, then re-encrypts it and sends it on its way. If you have only a single security device, that works pretty well. It's really when you acknowledge the need for kind of defense in depth and you have multiple layers of security, that it becomes important to offload that onto something else. So if you're doing encryption on a kind of standalone appliance, basically you'll need a way to route traffic, from your network, as it's flowing out to the internet or wherever, into that SSL appliance, and then a way to route traffic in and out of all the other security devices. Now, You can do that by physically cabling all those devices to each other. That becomes really difficult to manage, and if you need to do something like load balance across multiple devices or take one of those devices out for a firmware upgrade or something like that, it becomes pretty complex and problematic, and it's really easy for a software upgrade, let's say on one device, to kind of take your whole network down. And obviously that's not what anyone wants, right? Because downtime typically is pretty expensive. So you would often use something like a network packet broker as kind of the hub of your inline security deployment, just because it's very flexible. It lets you, rearrange the order of devices, or do load balancing across multiple devices, or detect maybe that I've got 3 IDS devices or IPSs and one of them fails, so I detect that and I take it out of my load balancing rotation, and that doesn't impact other things. So building that kind of security deployment in general around network packet broker, and if you're not familiar with those, it's basically like a very, very intelligent switch with a lot of value-add kind of processing on top of that. That sort of makes sense as the hub of that deployment. And if you're going to do that, then really SSL is just one more feature, right? And so rather than having to deploy kind of one more management console, one more standalone product that takes up more rack space, and you have to cable more stuff in and out, the easiest thing to do, certainly we think, is basically to just build this SSL inspection capability into your packet broker. And so traffic flows into it. It can do the SSL decryption. You can make passive copies of traffic that send out to a recording device or whatever. You can, or a passive inspection device. You can route traffic through active inspection devices, firewalls and IPSs and DLP systems and things like that. And when those are all done, the traffic just comes back into the packet broker, and then gets re-encrypted and sent on its way. And this really minimizes kind of the impact on your network. You're only doing that encryption and decryption once, and you get a lot of other benefits from kind of having this built into the packet broker. If you want to do, like in our case, if you want to do data masking, if you want to do NetFlow generation on that traffic, things like that, it's really easy to do because all that traffic is is already inside the packet broker. And so we've got a lot of different solutions that can help with this. The most popular one is the Vision 1 packet broker, which is one seen there on the bottom. It actually uses a dedicated plug-in crypto module that slides in the back. And so when you're doing up to like 10 gig of SSL, it doesn't impose any kind of processing overhead on the system because it's a dedicated resource. So nothing else slows down. It's got its own dedicated crypto, really easy to use because it's all integrated. Easy to do point and click. Like I mentioned, for compliance purposes, in many cases, let's say if you're required to save a copy, like an audit trail of web transactions. So everything that comes into your website, you want to save a copy of for 3 days or a week. And you want an audit trail that's independent of the logs that are saved on your server, because should the server be compromised, well, you can no longer trust those logs. Well, an easy way to do that is by having a decryption device that can just mirror a copy of traffic and go off to a recording system. But also for compliance reasons, you might want to mask certain personally identifiable information or sensitive data, such as credit card numbers. So we'll let you do things like overwrite, all but the last 4 or 5 digits of credit card numbers before sending it out to that, to that recording device. And so this lets you maintain your, security and compliance all with one system, and so sort of check a lot of those boxes at once. Now, another thing that if you're looking at, maybe you're deploying, could be big SSL load balancers, or even you're looking at, different like firewalls or other gear that can handle encryption. Doing SSL inspection can impose pretty significant kind of performance overhead on different kinds of security devices, depending on whether or not they've got dedicated crypto hardware on board and things like that. One of the ways that Ixia can help you is we actually make SSL test equipment. So if you want to know, let's say you're doing a bake-off between different things, again, say maybe load balancers or SSL load balancers for a big website, we can actually generate massive volumes of encrypted traffic and let you vary things like how many session setups per second and how long do the connections last. And so you can test those different devices, and we can send real data traffic through those connections, and even send things like malware. So if you want to say, hey, does my security system, can it handle not just 1.3, but can it handle my expected traffic demands and throughput and session setup rates? And by the way, can it find malware within those encrypted sessions? We'll let you test all of that, and so you can make sure that you're making the right decision for your network, because you're not surprised once something goes into production and you're not relying sort of just on data sheets for, oh, they say they can run this fast, and I hope they really mean that. Okay, and there is more information available here. You can just follow this link, and I think this webinar is available afterwards. So you can click on this link and download the complete survey. So if you want to see the full results or get more information, certainly you can follow up there. And with that, I will thank you for your time. And Raleigh, turn it back to you for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Scott. I will also be providing this link in the follow-up email, so I do encourage you to check that out. As I mentioned at the start, I will also provide the on-demand playback and a PDF of today's speaker's slides. So check out that email later today. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions. Starting with you, Scott, you had mentioned data sheets kind of as you were wrapping up your presentation. This question is, I'm not currently performing SSL inspection, but I think my company needs to start. Other than looking at vendor data sheets, where should I start?
So, I mean, that's a fairly broad question, but a good one. So one of the first things to do is think about your kind of scenario, right? Are you hosting services? Maybe do you have a website people are connecting to? Could be external, could be internal, because that's one kind of inspection scenario. Or are you mainly concerned because you have internal users who are going out to the internet, and maybe you're concerned about things that they're downloading? And I mentioned that just because the devices that you choose, kind of how you approach that, probably the performance requirements will be different. So think about which scenario you're going after first. And that also will help you to think about the kinds of threats that you're concerned with, right? And like the security vendor that you choose will probably be different depending on whether you're worried about attacks against your web server, where you probably want something called like a WAF, a web application firewall, or if it's really user behavior that you're worried about. That's what most next-gen firewalls are built for, and things like IDSs are really built to protect you from kind of poor user internet hygiene. So like understanding what you're protecting and what kind of traffic you want to inspect certainly is a help there. Once you're, when you're thinking about that, and certainly once you get down to saying, well, I want to maybe do a bake-off, I want to do an evaluation and see, okay, this particular kind of attack or threat, maybe it's data leak, maybe it's malware download, maybe it's, DDoS or other kinds of attacks against your web servers. Once you're ready to do that kind of testing, certainly we can help you, and we have SEs and engineers and white papers and things that can help kind of guide you through that process. If you want to take that additional step of saying, hey, I want to make sure that the stuff I'm deploying actually meets my requirements, so that when it's in production, it's actually doing the things that I want, and I know how I expect it to perform. So certainly you can follow up with us, and we've got engineers and things that can help with that. But hopefully those are some sort of guidelines to help you get started.
Thanks for that advice, Scott. I have a couple questions that are general questions about TLS 1.3. I'll start with you, Paula. The first one is, why do you think enterprises are moving so fast to adopt TLS 1.3?
Well, I guess there's a couple of answers that I'd give to that question. So obviously TLS 1.3 was 10 years in the making, so there's been plenty of publicity about the vulnerabilities in older versions of the standard. So there's some incentive to move in order to address those vulnerabilities, which are still being exploited. At the same time, there's also the move to public cloud computing, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or what have you. And that could also be putting pressure on organizations to strengthen their transport encryption to ensure workloads and data moving into the cloud are better protected. Actually, Cloudflare is one of the early cloud providers that implemented TLS 1.3, and they told me late last year that they were already getting requests for it. So there's some concerns there then. And then the other thing is IT security practitioners have come to the point where they're resigned to the fact that their networks are already compromised, and they see stronger transport encryption as a means to better secure mission-critical data. Hope that helps.
Yeah, one other note I would add to that, unlike, and just because sort of the world has changed, and this is different than it was, say, a decade ago when TLS 1.2 came out. Let's say, in many cases, some service provider, like a software vendor or services company, owns both ends of the connection. Think about people like Google or Apple or Microsoft, right? If they own the server and they own the web browser, and web browsers are auto-updating now, right? I mean, you never manually update your web browser, it just happens. And so this means if you're using a Microsoft browser, you're using Office 365 and it's going to Azure, Microsoft can make the migration 1.2 to 1.3, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And same for Apple, same for Google. So that change is happening, and it's really outside of an enterprise's control. Now that's largely the outbound use case I was talking about, but it still means that if you're going to do inspection of that traffic, well, your gear has to be able to handle 1.3. And if you're using, let's say, Microsoft services, whatever, inside your company, similarly, that change is going to happen. So whether you as an enterprise are kind of intentionally driving it or not, the world around you is going to move, and it's going to move because of forces outside your control. And a lot of those vendors are they're kind of concerned about the privacy piece, again, the Microsoft, Apple, Googles, and so they're really driving that forward as well.
Good to know. Thank you. This is a question that you can both weigh in on. It's any idea what's in store next for the TLS standard, or this is it? What do you both think?
So I'll throw out 2 points. It's never it. I mean, there's always this game of leapfrog, right, where the good guys move forward and then the bad guys move forward, and the good guys, and so weaknesses, I'm sure, will be found in ciphers or key exchange protocols or things like that, which will kind of mandate various changes moving forward. Also, one of the changes you saw in 1.3 is that what's called the zero round trip setup, which lets user sessions after the first time you visit a site, subsequent sessions will start much faster. And so I'm sure there will be other kind of incremental improvements to user experience and things like that. It's also interesting that because of it's hard to know right now how much difference this will make, but because of the expense required in modifying the monitoring infrastructure, it's a lot of financials really push back on this. And there is I won't say a competing standard, but maybe a derivative, ETS, that basically takes some of the improvements in 1.3 but removes the ephemeral key mandate, or it makes it easier to kind of export the session key so that people who have to do large-scale website monitoring can do it still in a passive way without having to introduce kind of man-in-the-middle devices. So it's possible that that movement kind of gains enough momentum that it's reintroduced as an option. The use of static keys or otherwise accessible session keys is reintroduced as an option. I don't know. It's hard to say if that's really going to catch on or not, but should that happen, it would probably mean a new version of the standard that accepts it. So those are two notes that I would make.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Scott, and that was a really great answer, by the way. There has been some pushback from large enterprises, especially in the financial services sector. There's an organization called the Enterprise Data Center Consortium, and when they realized where the IETF was going with TLS 1.3 with the Diffie-Hellman perfect forward secrecy key exchange, they really tried to get involved and sway the way that the standard went and failed. But I've had conversations with them, and they were still working to try to come up with some alternative to not have to go back and spend millions of dollars on their infrastructure to keep the visibility that they require. So there's always, there, like Scott said, there could be an alternative out there as far as the standards go. The other thing that I would say is that adoption does take a long time. And so, the IETF could be working already on the next version of it, but, people aren't necessarily going to jump on it right away, although we did find in the survey that a lot of people have already started that adoption process. But, there's always going to be the laggards, and, we asked people, which versions they were mandating as part of their policies, and some of them were still mandating, TLS 1.2 or earlier. So, there's always a range in how quickly enterprises adopt new standards.
Thanks, Paula. This next question segues into something you just talked about, which is why should people feel pressured to move to this new standard?
Well, so there's actually no technical reason why they have to move, at least immediately, because there's no requirement from any standards bodies to upgrade to 1.3 now. And enterprises can still fall back to TLS 1.2 using non-forward secrecy for the time being. It'll be the standard, 5 to 10 years down the road, and then everyone will have to use it. But, those vendors do carry a lot of weight, and they really are attempting to move the industry forward, most likely in order to demonstrate their commitment to their customers' privacy. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think, Paula, that you're exactly right. The kind of peer pressure is more important than regulatory issues, let's say, right? And driving companies to implement TLS 1.3 on their servers. But again, I'd go back to that forward proxy versus reverse proxy, where forward proxy is users going out to the internet, and reverse proxy is people from the internet coming in and talking to your web servers. For that forward proxy use case where your users are going out and talking to, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple, whatever, if you want to continue, if you're doing inspection of that encrypted traffic and you want to continue to do so, then those inspection devices that you have will have to support TLS 1.3, whether you like it or not, just because the browsers that people are using, the devices people are using, and the websites that they're going to are going to move to TLS 1.3, again, whether you like it or not. So you'll be required pretty much to support that, even if you don't deploy it yet on your servers or your own, internet-facing services.
Good to know. Thank you both for that feedback. Scott, another question for you is, you didn't really talk much about using integrated decryption within a security appliance. Why is that?
So I assume that means within like a UTM or a firewall or something. So I'm going to respond as if that's the question. If it's not, let me know. You can certainly do it. And there are certainly, firewalls, things like that will do the decryption, inspection, and then re-encryption all in the device. That is certainly an option. And it's, a good option if you have only one layer of security. Typically, though, if you go with a multi-vendor approach and you want kind of multiple best-of-breed devices rather than having a kind of counting on a single device or vendor to provide all of your security, you're going to want a good way to decrypt once and then share data across multiple devices. And I think some firewalls will let you do a limited amount of that, but if you want functionality like load balancing or data masking for mirrored traffic when it's going to a recording device so that you maintain compliance, if you want to have things like that, you're really going to be looking at an external encryption solution rather than doing it in an integrated appliance. So again, if you're going just with one security device and that's all you need or that's all you want to deploy, sure, you can absolutely do it there. It's really when you're looking at kind of more of a defense in depth strategy that you need to do SSL offload.
Thank you.
I hope that I understood the question correctly.
Thank you. I didn't get any feedback, so we'll assume you did. And
okay.
Let's take one final question. It is, privacy advocates are trying to push encrypted SNI in TLS 1.3. Will that create even more challenges for filtering of web traffic?
Yeah. Short answer, yes. And Paula, at the end, chime in if you have a thought. So if you're trying to do things like, let's say you're doing SSL inspection for users going to the Internet, and you want to bypass inspection for certain categories of sites. Let's say users going to healthcare providers. That's a really common use case. Or users going to their banks, right? You have no interest in inspecting traffic when your employees go, check their checking accounts or go to their doctor, right? You're willing to say, I'm not going to inspect that. Not so worried about malware downloads inside that because I respect my employees' privacy. You can, if you can see the SNI, if it's clear text, then you can sort of make that decision without doing any encryption because you can just look at their certificate and say, oh, hey, I know that this is whatever, Bank of America or U.S. Bank or whatever, and I'm not going to decrypt that. If all the information that would otherwise, was previously available clear text is now encrypted, then you have, that's no longer an option, right? You've got to do that in decryption to say, oh, now I know that this is healthcare traffic. And that's going to make it harder to, you no longer have the option of completely bypassing the inspection. You then will have to kind of demonstrate for audit purposes that, I decrypted the traffic, then I re-encrypted it without sending it to any kind of monitoring device. That's a much more kind of complex process. It's got much more overhead, and there's possibilities for things to go wrong. So I understand that there are some benefits because otherwise I can look at a clear text exchange and know, and say, I know what site this person's going to. I can't read the data, but I can read the SNI, I can read other certificate information and know what site they were going to without doing decryption. And now I can't, so yay privacy. But if your job is making sure malware doesn't get into your network, and so you're doing inspection for those purposes, that privacy acts completely contrary to security. And so, it's definitely a trade-off, but yes, that absolutely makes life harder, and it makes it harder actually to protect, let's say, employee privacy if you are also concerned about security.
Thanks, Scott. That brings us to the top of the hour, so I'm going to conclude today's event. I wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. I hope you'll check out the email that EMA will be sending out later today, and I hope that we'll see you at a future webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.